I didn't plan on burying an entire gated community under a moving wall of dust. But when I came back and saw what they did to my land, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to end with a polite conversation and a handshake. It started quiet, almost boring actually, like most bad stories do. I was heading out for a 4-day agricultural seminar down in New Mexico, something I'd done a dozen times before, just farmers talking soil health, wind erosion, water retention, stuff most people scroll past, but stuff that keeps land alive. Before I left, I walked my western boundary like I always did, boots crunching dry gravel, checking the line of trees I'd spent nearly 20 years growing, cedar and mesquite mostly, tough species, the kind that don't just survive wind, they break it, slow it down, turn a violent gust into something manageable. Those trees weren't decoration, they were infrastructure, same as a fence or a well, maybe more important honestly, because out here, wind doesn't just blow, it steals. Soil, moisture, seeds, everything. And beyond that tree line, about half a mile out, sat this brand new development called Silver Ridge Estates. Yeah, one of those places, fresh asphalt that still smelled like chemicals in the sun, identical houses lined up like they were stamped out of a machine, lawns so green they looked fake, and at the entrance, this oversized stone monument with a metal sign screaming, "Luxury Living," like it needed to convince itself. When they first opened, their HOA president, her name was Denise Carver, mid-40s, sharp blazer, that kind of smile that feels rehearsed, came out to introduce herself. She shook my hand like we were closing a deal, looked past me at my land more than she looked at me, and said something along the lines of, "We're really excited to be neighbors," which, translated, usually means, "We're about to ask you for something." Sure enough, a few minutes in, she brought it up, said some residents had noticed my tree line was blocking their sunset view from the clubhouse balcony, and asked, real casual, if I'd consider trimming them back, just enough to open things up visually. I remember laughing a little, not to be rude, just because the request itself was kind of ridiculous, and I told her straight, "Sunsets are free, Denise, but that windbreak isn't." She gave me this tight nod, like she was filing that answer away for later, said she understood, and we left it there. Or at least, I thought we did. Fast forward 4 days. I'm driving back up the county road, and something feels off before I even see it. There's dust in the air, not unusual out here, but this was thicker, like the ground itself was unsettled. Then I get closer, and I see the gap, and my stomach just drops. Where there used to be a solid wall of green, there's nothing, just open land. I pull over, step out, and it hits me all at once. Those trees are gone. Not trimmed, not thinned, not selectively managed, gone. Bulldozed. What's left are jagged stumps sticking out of the dirt like broken teeth, splinters everywhere, the soil ripped open with deep track marks from heavy equipment. It looked less like landscaping and more like a crime scene. I walked the line slowly, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I saw it, a laminated notice zip-tied to one of my fence posts, neat, official-looking, full of legal-sounding language about vegetation clearance, improving sightlines, and reducing fire risk. No signature from me, no agreement, just a statement like it had already been decided. I remember just standing there, holding that paper, feeling this mix of disbelief and something colder, because this wasn't an accident, this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was someone deciding they had the authority to alter my land because it didn't match their idea of a better view. And the worst part? The consequences didn't wait. Within hours, I could see the soil starting to shift, not dramatically at first, just a fine layer lifting when the wind picked up, like the land was testing its new vulnerability. See, those trees had been doing a job every single day. Invisible work, slowing down wind speeds, trapping moisture, anchoring the topsoil. Remove them, and you don't just change the scenery, you remove the system holding everything in place. By that evening, I could already see streaks forming where dirt was being carried off, thin lines stretching east, straight towards Silver Ridge. I didn't call Denise, didn't call the HOA, didn't even call the county right away. Instead, I went back to my barn, fired up the tractor, and just sat there for a minute with the engine idling, thinking, because at that point, I had two options: react emotionally and get nowhere, or respond in a way they couldn't ignore. And if there's one thing 20 years of working land teaches you, it's patience and leverage. So I chose the second one. Now let me pause the story for a second, because what happened here, this wasn't just some petty neighbor dispute. This is actually a textbook example of how HOA power gets misunderstood and abused. According to standard procedure, an HOA only has authority over properties within its own governed community, meaning they can enforce rules about lawn height, paint color, even what kind of mailbox you install. But the second they step outside that boundary and start making decisions about land they don't own, especially agricultural land, they're walking into serious legal trouble. From a legal perspective, what Denise and her board likely committed falls somewhere between trespassing and property damage, and depending on the state, possibly even environmental negligence, because removing a functional windbreak in a dry region isn't just cosmetic. It directly alters erosion patterns, which can impact surrounding properties, including their own. And here's where it gets interesting. This is a psychological trap a lot of HOA boards fall into. They start with small wins, enforcing minor rules, getting compliance, and over time, they develop this inflated sense of authority, like they're not just managing a neighborhood, they're controlling an environment. Add in residents who expect perfect views and premium aesthetics, and suddenly, practical systems like a windbreak get reframed as visual obstructions. The lesson here is simple but critical. When people prioritize appearance over function, especially in systems they don't fully understand, they tend to create problems they're not equipped to solve. And in this case, they didn't just create a problem, they triggered a chain reaction they couldn't control. So, I let it play out for about 12 hours, just watching how the land responded, how the wind moved now that nothing was there to slow it down, and by the time the sun dipped low that evening, I already knew exactly what was coming, and more importantly, how to guide it. I wasn't going to fight the wind. I was going to cooperate with it. That night, I hitched up my grading blade and drove straight to the cleared strip where my trees used to stand, and I started working the soil, back and forth, slow and deliberate, breaking up the surface, turning compacted earth into fine, loose powder, the kind that doesn't stay put when the wind gets ambitious. Now, to anyone driving by, it probably looked like I was just doing routine land maintenance. Nothing aggressive, nothing illegal, just a rancher tending his property. But every pass of that blade was setting the stage, priming the ground like dry tinder waiting for a spark. By the time I shut the tractor down, the entire stretch between my ranch and Silver Ridge was unstable, let's call it that, and directly downwind, like a target painted in plain sight, stood their pride and joy, that oversized stone entrance, decorative gravel perfectly arranged, imported shrubs spaced out like a showroom display, lights embedded in the ground to highlight every detail, and that polished metal sign catching the last bit of sunlight like it was posing for a brochure. The next afternoon, right on schedule, the forecast delivered exactly what I needed. Gusts pushing 40 miles per hour, bone-dry air, not a hint of moisture to hold anything in place. I remember standing by the fence line, leaning against one of the posts they hadn't torn out, watching the horizon as the wind started to build, low at first, then stronger, steady, like a machine winding up. And then, I opened my pasture gates. That's it. No dramatic move, no big gesture, just a quiet decision to let nature take over. The first wave was subtle, a thin veil of dust lifting off the ground, skimming across the surface like smoke, but within minutes, it escalated. The loose soil I'd prepared didn't resist. It rose, rolled, gathered into thick, moving clouds, and once it started, there was no stopping it. It pushed forward, slow but relentless, like a tide made of dirt, and Silver Ridge was directly in its path. I watched as that luxury entrance began to disappear, inch by inch, the base of the stone pillars getting swallowed first, then the gravel pathways vanishing under layers of drifting sand, those carefully placed shrubs bending, then disappearing entirely as the dust piled up around them. Cars started pulling up, slowing down, confused at first, then struggling, tires spinning slightly as the ground shifted beneath them. And within maybe 20 minutes, the whole front section of that neighborhood looked like it had been dropped into the middle of a desert storm. Visibility dropped, the air turned thick, and everything they had designed to look clean, controlled, and perfect was completely out of control. My phone started ringing before the wind even peaked. First call, unknown number, I let it go. Second call, same thing. Third call, I picked up. It was Denise, and she didn't bother with the polite tone this time. What did you do? She snapped. No greeting, no build-up, just straight to accusation. I leaned back against the fence, watching another wave roll through their entrance, and I said, calm as could be, I didn't do anything, Denise. I'm just managing my land. She wasn't having it, started talking about damages, about how residents couldn't get in and out safely, how this was clearly intentional. And that's when I shifted, just slightly, because this is where emotion loses and facts win. I told her, what's intentional is someone sending heavy equipment across my boundary and destroying a functional windbreak without permission. And then I paused, just long enough for that to sink in, and added, I've got drone footage of your contractors crossing onto my property, timestamps, everything. Silence on the other end for a second. Then she tried a different angle, said maybe there had been a misunderstanding, maybe a contractor went too far. I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, and said, that's interesting, because I've already shared that footage with a local news station. They love this kind of thing, especially when it involves property disputes and environmental impact. That changed the temperature immediately. The conversation ended not long after that, but the situation? That kept escalating. By the end of the day, emergency crews were out there trying to clear the main entrance just so residents could get through. Shovels, small plows, even a couple of utility vehicles pushing sand off the road. And the homeowners, the people who had moved there for peaceful living and scenic views, were furious. But not at me. See, once the story started spreading, once people realized this wasn't some random dust storm but a direct consequence of a decision their HOA made, the frustration shifted inward. Residents started questioning the board, asking why they thought they could alter land they didn't own, why no one considered the environmental impact, why a better sunset view was worth turning their entrance into a sand trap. And that's the thing about consequences. They don't just hit the target you expect, they ripple outward. And in this case, the ripple turned into pressure, and that pressure landed squarely on Denise and her board. By the second day, I heard they had an emergency meeting, voices raised, people demanding accountability, some even talking about legal action, not against me, but against the HOA itself. And then, about a week later, I got another visit. Same driveway, same walk up to my porch, but a very different energy. Denise wasn't leading this time. She was part of a small group, quieter, more measured, like they'd finally realized they weren't in control of this situation anymore. She started talking, but the tone was completely different. No assumptions, no authority, just negotiation. They offered to fund a new windbreak, said they'd bring in specialists, install temporary barriers to stabilize the soil, even compensate me for the stress on my livestock. I listened, didn't interrupt, just let them lay everything out, and when she finished, I nodded once and said, that's a start. Then I gave them my terms. I told them they would rebuild the entire tree line at their expense, same length, same density, no shortcuts, and they wouldn't just plant it and walk away, they'd be responsible for maintaining it long-term, irrigation, replacement, everything. On top of that, I wanted a land protection fee, $5,000 a month for 5 years. And I made one thing very clear, miss a single payment, and I stopped stabilizing the soil. No threats, no raised voice, just a statement of cause and effect. They looked at each other, you could see the calculation happening, weighing cost against risk, and the truth is, they didn't really have a better option. Because now they understood something they hadn't before. The land doesn't negotiate, but I do. And a few days later, they signed. So yeah, that's how a better sunset view turned into a 5-year contract and a very expensive lesson in how land actually works. And if you're sitting there thinking this is just some wild revenge story, like, cool, entertaining, a little extreme maybe, I get it. But honestly, the real value here isn't the dust storm. It's what led up to it, and what it reveals about how people think when they're operating inside systems like HOAs, corporate boards, or honestly any structure where authority starts to feel a little too comfortable. The lesson here is control without understanding is dangerous. And I don't mean that in some abstract, philosophical way. I mean it very literally. Denise and her board weren't evil. They weren't sitting in a room plotting how to destroy my land. They just didn't respect what they didn't understand. To them, those trees were an inconvenience, a visual obstruction, something that lowered the perceived value of their community. But that's the thing. Perception and reality don't always line up. especially when you're dealing with natural systems. You can't manage land the same way you manage a homeowner's newsletter or a landscaping schedule. And this is where a lot of these conflicts start. People move into these curated environments, clean streets, uniform lawns, controlled aesthetics, and over time, they start to believe everything around them should follow that same logic. Straight lines, predictable outcomes, immediate results. But nature doesn't work like that. It's slower, more complex, and a lot less forgiving when you make the wrong call. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. This wasn't just about trees, this was about boundaries. Legal boundaries, environmental boundaries, and psychological ones too. Because once someone crosses a line and nothing pushes back, they're more likely to cross the next one. That's how small oversteps turn into major violations. In this case, it started with a request. Hey, can you trim your trees? Reasonable on the surface. Then it moved to assumption. We can probably handle this ourselves. And finally, action. Bulldozers on land they didn't own. That progression? It happens all the time, not just in HOAs, but in workplaces, relationships, anywhere people test limits. And most of the time, it works because nobody responds in a way that resets the boundary. But when someone does, when there's a clear, undeniable consequence, it forces a recalibration. And that's exactly what happened here. Now, let's talk about the other side for a second, because I know what some of you are thinking. Was that overkill? Maybe. I'm not going to sit here and pretend it was the most gentle solution available. There were probably more traditional routes: lawyers, court filings, months of back and forth, expert witnesses talking about soil displacement and wind patterns. And yeah, that path might have worked eventually. But it also would have taken time, money, and a whole lot of patience while the damage to my land kept getting worse. What I did was immediate. It translated an invisible problem into a visible one. Because before the dust storm, erosion was just a concept, something you read about, something you assume is manageable. After the dust storm, it was sitting in their driveways, blocking their cars, costing them time and money. And people respond differently when they can feel the impact directly. That's not just strategy, that's human nature. This is a psychological trap we fall into all the time. We ignore slow, invisible damage until it becomes fast and undeniable. Climate issues, infrastructure decay, even personal health, we push things aside until they demand attention. And in this case, the windbreak was that invisible system holding everything together, quietly doing its job until it was gone. From a legal perspective, this situation also highlights something important. Ownership isn't just about what's written on paper, it's about responsibility. If you alter a system, especially one connected to land, water, or shared environments, you're also taking on the consequences of that change, whether you intended to or not. The HOA learned that the hard way. They thought they were improving their property value, but in reality, they were exposing themselves to liability, not just from me, but from their own residents. And once that liability became visible, once it started affecting access, safety, daily life, everything shifted. So what's the takeaway for you? Whether you're dealing with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or honestly any situation where someone's overstepping, understand the system before you react. Know where your leverage is. Because leverage isn't always about force, it's about positioning. It's about recognizing what the other side depends on, what they're overlooking, and how consequences actually flow through that system. And sometimes, the most effective response isn't the loudest one. It's the one that lets reality do the talking. Now I'm curious, what would you have done in that situation? Would you have gone the legal route, played it slow and safe? Or would you have done something similar, something that forces the issue into the open? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I can tell you right now, this kind of situation happens way more often than people think. It just doesn't always end with a sandstorm.